All right, we're just about to start. I think so. There might still be a few people dropping in, but we'll just be kicking off. Welcome, everyone. Lovely to see so many people attending this briefing. Of course, as you might have heard, this week was the 11th release of the Rental Affordability Index, and today we'll be going through some of the key results, and after that, a panel discussion. But before I jump into that, just a few practical things. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A button to submit your questions. We do have a panel discussion and hope to address as many questions as we can in that session. So please don't use the chat function, but the Q&A function for that. This session will also be recorded and will be made available after the session. Before we get into that, first of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land that we are meeting on today. For me, that is the land of the Molucca in southern part of Tasmania, and we're meeting from a whole range of different locations today as we meet online. SGS Economics and Planning acknowledges that the Indigenous peoples of Australia are the oldest living culture on Earth, have the oldest continuing land tenure system in the world, and have the oldest continuing land use planning and management system in the world. We acknowledge that you have suffered the indignity of having your land taken from you without your consent, without a treaty, and without compensation. We acknowledge that these matters are yet to be justly resolved. So today, the results will be presented to you in quite a bit of detail. And also, I'm really excited to announce our panel consisting of our key partners for the Rental Affordability Index. My name is Ellen Witte. I'm a principal and partner at SGS Economics and Planning, and with my colleagues Kishan and Nat, been leading the Rental Affordability Index since its inception in 2015. And today on the panel we have, first of all, John Engler. He joined Shelter New South Wales as a CEO in early 2020, having been involved in the formation, development and operation of social, affordable and specialist housing for most of his professional life. He has a master's degree in urban and regional planning and has undertaken postgraduate legal studies. Having spent a number of years in the private, public and community sectors, he especially enjoys the opportunity to contribute to innovative housing responses, delivering solutions to those for whom the market falls short. So welcome, John. Lovely to have you here today. And of course, Shelter has been the instigator of the Rental Affordability Index. Dan McKenna, also here today. Hi, Dan, on the panel. Dan is the CEO of Housing All Australians, leading national efforts to unlock private sector solutions to the housing crisis and turn goodwill into real homes for people in need. A former CEO of Nightingale Housing, he delivered award-winning community-minded developments and continues to champion bold practical reform to create a fairer, more sustainable housing system across Australia. Welcome, Dan. And then last but not least, Kishan Ratnam. Hi, Kishan, is a senior associate and partner at SGS Economics and Planning, and leads the research and analysis of the Rental Affordability Index. Like me, he's been involved since the very start of the RAI, and his expertise spans demand forecasting and gap analysis across sectors, including residential and employment land, retail, education, sporting facilities, and affordable housing. He has expertise in economics and mathematics and serves as a media commentator on the Rental Affordability Index. So lovely to have you all here today. Before we jump into the results of the RAI, I quickly wanted to give a bit of an overview of where this all started. And that's now sort of 10, 11 years ago. The first release was in 2015, where we started at the time with CEO National Shelter Adrian Pisarski, who had come up with the idea of a rental affordability index, following some examples, I believe, in the US. From there on, we worked on a pro bono basis at SGS and set up a committee of some leading experts in the area of housing to develop an indicator for rental affordability that was academically sound and practical to be updated every year. So we included Greg Peel, who was from the, at the time, existing community sector banking, Owen Donald from Ahuri, Professor Judith Yates from the University of Sydney, Professor Hall Paulson from UNSW, who we saw to this week as well when we had our briefing in Parliament House, and well-known economist Sol Estlake. So this started as a partnership specifically between National Shelter and SGS, and at the time, some sponsorship we received from community sector banking. Over time, we developed the method further to introduce different household profiles. So as you will see today, there's now 10 different household types included in the index that show what the lived experience of rental affordability in Australia is for these typical household types. Over time, we've added and changed more in that regard, had deep dives in different types of issues. Of course, around 2021, we had COVID hitting, and that in many ways was a bit of a living experiment in how much rental affordability can change, and also what contributions to lowest income households can do in terms of affordability. So this year, we're very excited to welcome our new partner, Housing All Australians. And I think we now, the three of us, are able to provide and represent a broad alliance stemming from the social services sector and lowest income household types and people suffering most in the rental market, all the way to business owners and the business community, demonstrating how housing rental affordability is affecting productivity in the country, and how this is also an economic matter. And that reinforces the message that housing is essential infrastructure. Just like you plan for key transport infrastructure, you should be planning for housing infrastructure. And that is, of course, something that has deteriorated since the late 70s, when we still had 10% of our housing stock being social housing, to at the current situation where it's barely 3%. I'll leave that history where it is for now, and we can, of course, come back to that later. And if we go to the next slide, Kishan. I might just again mention what actually is the Rental Affordability Index. The index really is a price index, so it looks at what percentage of what percentage of income people pay on rent on a weekly basis. And it's well supported through academic sources that whenever low to moderate income households pay 30% of their income or more on rent, they're in a situation of housing stress. So the index calculates that particular threshold. So when the score is 100, those households are right on the threshold of unaffordability. And if that percentage goes up, that means that these households typically don't have sufficient funds to pay for other primary needs, such as heating, cooling, transport, education, and medicine. So just to make it easy to digest in a map. So we've mapped housing affordability, rental affordability across the nation, typically at the postcode level. And so there is also an interactive map, which we'll direct you to in the end. And we've used a fairly simple traffic light system that shows from very affordable rents from dark green to increasingly less affordable. So wherever it starts to be yellow, orange, all the way to red and purple, that shows that rents are very unaffordable. A few years ago, we actually added an extra color, a bit in line with what the Bureau of Meteorology did a few years ago to show extreme heat occurring in Australia as a result of climate change. They added this purple category of, I think it was 50 degrees Celsius and over. We've added this category to show that an increasingly large share of households, if they wanted to live in an area, they might have to pay 75% of their income or more on rent. That's obviously undoable. So that really shows that whole groups in society are being pushed out of rental markets. And if we go to the next one. I think we're handing over, yes.
Yes, thanks, Ellen.
So that's just a bit of an overview of what is the index, and Kishan will run you through the key results to show what the data represent this year, just to have a bit of an overview and before we go into the panel.
Thanks, Ellen, and welcome everyone. Yeah, as Ellen said, I'll take you through some of the key results before we get into the majority of this session, which will be a Q&A with the panel. So the results I'll take you through are going to be primarily for an average rental household in each of our, well, some of our capital cities. But of course, one of the things that the Rental Affordability Index focuses on is the nuance of affordability. So lots of different household types and lots of different locations. So all of that data is available to explore on the interactive dashboard and map, which we'll provide a link to at the end. So looking at Sydney and Melbourne as our largest two capitals, there are some what John will call green shoots that we've found in the past 12 months of the data, and that is that after about 3 years of steep decline in affordability, both Sydney and Melbourne have begun to stabilize. But having said that, they are still at their least affordable point that we've recorded in the over 10 years that we've been developing the Rental Affordability Index. So, you know, an average rental household in each of the cities is still paying between 25 and 30% of their income on rent. What that looks like spatially is quite stark as well. So Sydney's always been relatively unaffordable compared to other capitals. But really what this map shows as it cycles through the years, and I'll let it play for a little bit, is that 10 years ago, an average rental household could afford a much larger part of the city. Whereas now, and you'll see it as it comes up to 2025, really the only places that remain affordable are Western Sydney beyond Parramatta and Southwestern Sydney, so the growth corridor. And Melbourne has a pretty similar trend, although overall it is one of the more affordable capitals, at this point second only to Canberra. But again, 10 years ago, most of the city was affordable to that average rental household. So on the income that average rental households earn. But now that's become limited really to the western and northern growth areas and some parts of the southeast. So I'll let that play through one more time for you to see the real change spatially and how that unaffordability has spread across the city. Another key highlight from this year's analysis is that Perth has become Australia's least affordable capital. And that's quite a significant swing, given that it was the most affordable capital in the latter half of the 2010s. Now, Perth is somewhat a special case. Economic cycles, particularly in the mining sector, have a strong effect on rental markets in Perth. But it doesn't change the fact that, and you'll see this as it comes up to 2025, the entire metropolitan area is not affordable to an average rental household. So it's not just the very low or low income households that would struggle in Perth, but it's a broader systemic issue. I also wanted to quickly touch on what's happening in the regions. And this has been quite a different story to the capital cities, and not a good one. So affordability in all regional areas has consistently declined since 2020, to the point at which regional areas are now often less affordable than their capital city counterparts in each state. And that's despite rents being lower, the fact that incomes are quite a bit lower in those regions more than offsets that. There are a range of drivers that we've looked at for this, but some of the significant ones are the changing locational preferences and increased mobility that we've seen over the last 5 years after the pandemic, particularly as remote and flexible work becomes more common. And there's been that internal migration from cities to regions, and it takes time for local housing markets to respond to that. Where that's been most acute is really in the peri-urban and coastal areas of the regions, and we've got New South Wales and Victoria here. And that affects both the average renters there, but particularly low-income households and essential workers who are required for those economies to function. And I'm sure Dan will talk to that much more. And finally, a slight outlier that I think is interesting and worth discussing, which is the ACT or Canberra, which has become the most affordable capital city since 2023. There are a few things to keep in mind with that result, which is that Canberra has relatively high incomes compared to the rest of the country. But there are also a combination of policy and market conditions which have contributed to that. So examples could be Canberra's had highest housing supply recently. It has had high rising household incomes. And also since 2019, a CPI-linked rent increase cap. So rents can be increased once a year at no more than 110% of inflation. With that in mind, and this is something that the Rental Affordability Index really brings out, it's that it's not a one-size-fits-all issue or solution. So that's kind of shown on this slide here, where we can see the affordability profile in Canberra for an average rental household on the left, which looks reasonably good. But then a hospitality worker in the middle pane, and then a lower income household, so a single person on benefits. And yeah, this basically shows that the reality isn't the same for everyone, and that the complexity of the challenge in improving affordability needs multiple responses. And I'm sure John will speak to what needs to be done to support very low and low income households, whereas Dan will expand on how affordability is also that economic issue and how the private sector can be engaged. And this isn't specific to Canberra. It's also the same across all of the cities. And just to illustrate that point, here's the profile for, say, a pensioner couple in Sydney and Melbourne, looking for a two-bedroom dwelling on an income of 66,000 a year. Or similarly, looking at that hospitality worker in Sydney and Melbourne, looking for just a one-bedroom dwelling. And I suppose another insight from these maps is the grey areas essentially represent insufficient data, which is that there isn't a large supply of one-bedroom dwellings in those areas. So it's not just an affordability issue; it's an availability question as well. That was the overview of this year's rental
Thanks.
affordability index and findings. So I might pass it back to you, Ellen.
Thank you, Kishan. I think that just gives a quite sweet and short overview of what's really been occurring in the markets. And so overall, what we've seen, most capital cities have stabilized, or sometimes I wonder, has it bottomed out, with affordability still at an all-time low for most of the capital cities. And since the pandemic, what we've seen is a quick deterioration of rental affordability everywhere, but especially in the regions. As I guess during the pandemic, some people moved out from the cities to the regions, pushing prices up as they brought their city incomes along. Because we shouldn't forget that income levels for rental households in the region are 25 to 28% lower than for their urban counterparts, and that's for Victoria, New South Wales. So that can have a profound impact, of course, on what rental prices do in the region. And I think the COVID has structurally changed the way we work and live. And as a result, I think is what we notice is that move has not stopped after COVID, and the regions are paying the price for that at the moment. So just over to John. Really interested to hear from National Shelter your view on what are the implications of these results, and then what sort of policy responses are you advocating?
Thanks, Ellen and Kishan. And again, to SGS Economics especially, this is a particularly useful product that we've found more and more useful. And I'll just talk very quickly. I was in the ACT until Canberra till early this morning. I noticed just on the dynamic maps that were there, that very great example that Kishan used about the ACT. I'll come back to why the ACT is a really good example. But we work across jurisdictions. The mapping allows, pardon me, the ability to be able to contrast and compare areas. So often in the ACT, we know it's quite an expensive rental market. People would say, oh, well, for those on low and very low income, so the people that we advocate for, the people on the bottom two quintiles, the argument might be, well, you could look across the border in New South Wales to Queanbeyan. But as Kashan's mapping just shows, when you break it down to the groups, the purple area, the suburb of Queanbeyan especially also has difficulty in terms of the rents, and was showing as that purple colour. So this idea that somehow people can, if they're experiencing rental stress, paying more than 30% of their low or very low income, well, can't they just find somewhere else? Two things. We don't have the vacancy rates of the available type, and often accompanying areas seem to then, not unsurprisingly, also become more unaffordable. And I think that's the real pattern of the data. Seeing it spatially, you can drill down to a particular postcode for a particular cohort group, see what the implications are, and extrapolate back out to the macro level. The good thing for us, I suppose, and it is a bit optimistic at one level to talk about green shoots, is what's to be done about it. So when we say green shoots, there are two ways. Those nominal changes, particularly with the ACT, a 4% improvement, we might say, in affordability, shows that, as Kashan has mentioned, particular policy approaches do work, and we need to give them time to work and be confident that they do. So, introducing some rental reform and regulation in the ACT, which indeed leads the country, has the strongest rental protection laws, and by virtue of the fact that we don't even have some data for the Northern Territory, it is the least able to demonstrate rental protections. They don't even have a formal bond system in the Northern Territory, hence we can't get data to show. So we're working on that, and this week we've made some gains at a federal level around campaigning for that, so that next time we hope it will be there. But suffice to say, the ACT deliberately making decisions to say rents can only go up by the 10% and only once a year, plus the CPI, is starting to work. So what we'd like to see more of, two levels, the green shoots in the form of both direct state and territory intervention or protections around renters. That's what states and territories have historically done. But also the Commonwealth has a role, not only in terms of leadership and pointing out the lack of harmonisation across state and territory laws, but they themselves have particular levers that they can use to make sure that they're making a difference. So pleased to say this particular 47th Parliament has moved the functions that are to do with rental protection and the rental market. A, they've beefed it up, and B, they've moved it into Treasury, which is significant for government to acknowledge that in order to make a difference and what they call a better deal for renters, it has to be done through the machinery of government that includes Treasury functions. And that also extends to their direct provisions around tax settings such as build to rent. So one of the questions I think we've had about this is how can we improve the situation for renters? We need to grow the affordable rental stock that's available, and also to change the settings. Often we see, and we do in this country, have an over-reliance on mum and dad investors, sometimes a pejorative term, but it really means that they're there for price-seeking reasons and often turn over stock within 4 or 5 years. And the Rental Commissioner in New South Wales points that out. We often see properties turn over every 5 years. What we want, and the Commonwealth has this direct lever, encouraging long-term institutional build to rent, that is by definition aimed at security for the long time, especially for people on lower incomes, not part of a trading of asset renewal or asset cycling or people seeking rents around property transactions. So that's one thing. As I've mentioned, having a rental commissioner. So in this country, we have two now. Heather Holst has been the rental commissioner in the ACT in Victoria since 2018. Trina Jones is the rental commissioner in New South Wales. So better protections and having somebody there to represent tenants' rights at a state level. In New South Wales, we've introduced no grounds eviction last year. The Victorians introduced some protections this week. And just being able to say that people have a right to longer leases, a better condition as renters, and not to feel somehow that it's a second-class type of tenure, that they're the sorts of things we're starting to see. So the Commonwealth backing that in, and also the states, gives you a much more cumulative effect of what's the benefit for renters. Just finally, I'll touch on here because it does involve, ultimately, the housing system is big and complex and has multi-parts. We often hear questions about short-term rental, not a huge focus of this particular study, but certainly enough hotspots in the mapping to see a couple of areas that are impacted directly by what else is going on, not just for housing, but the economy more broadly. So that's infrastructure and productivity. And I know Dan will speak to that. But in northern New South Wales, Byron Bay, no one here thinks that we should somehow be stopping tourism. But what we're saying is if tourism is going to be done well, we need to make sure that the workers who are involved in tourism also themselves can afford the rents, not having to travel great distances, particularly where they're otherwise getting moderate wages and are traveling out of hours. We need to make sure that in order for these areas to be productive, it's not at the expense of the tenancy or the rental provisions that go with those very key workers or the essential workers that require the tourism in the town to succeed. So just to finish on that note, government can do things directly, all levels of government. In the case of Byron Bay, that particular local council is looking and experimenting with how it can restrict the number of days that other dwellings can otherwise be made available for the short-term accommodation market. The state government's got its tenancy laws, and the federal government, not only can it do things directly through build to rent leadership, pleased to say this week it announced another 21,000 properties through what's called round 3 of the HAF, Housing Australia Future Fund. This report, and we've made this case to government and it's already responded to say, we hear you, definitely demonstrates that a certain percentage of that should be absolutely directed at the regions. The report indicates that, and government has heard that this week in the feedback that we've had with the minister's staff, Minister O'Neill, the Minister for Housing, Homelessness and Cities. I'll leave it there. Happy to take any questions. Thank you, Ellen.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, John. I think that's a nice quick overview, and I'm sure later on we'll touch on some of that in a bit more. I think also probably mentioned, of course, a few times is this measure around some limitations or guide rails basically around by how much you let rents increase every year. I think potentially also relevant to say around that is that when we were in a cost of living crisis, I'm not sure we're even out of it yet, with those very high levels of inflation, as a result of that, we saw, of course, interest rates increasing. As a result of that, we also saw landlords trying to recoup some of those increased costs by increasing rents, and sometimes excessively so. And we saw during that period of high inflation that rent increases were themselves starting to be one of the major contributors to inflation. And that, of course, then resulting again in further interest rate rises. So you can see how that could feed into a vicious circle. And also from that perspective, you can consider that guiding rent increases is also macroeconomic policy that can be very important. And the demand for housing and rental housing is, of course, very inelastic. That's the thing people buy, purchase, consume first over anything else, because everyone needs a roof over their head. So whenever you have a market with inelastic demand, if you put out subsidies such as private rent assistance and all sorts of other subsidies, if you don't guide price increases, that just results in higher prices, and that, of course, does not go to the most vulnerable in society. So there's quite a strong economic case there as well, if I just may say so. Before you hand over to Dan, CEO from Housing All Australians, really interested to hear from you, Dan, how important it is to engage private sector in this issue around rental affordability, and also seeing housing as a productivity issue.
Yeah, amazing. Thanks, Ellen, and thanks everyone for joining today. I might start by saying a little bit about who Housing All Australians is, who we are, because that really shapes kind of the perspective that I'm bringing to this conversation. So we bring the private sector voice to the national housing discussion. We're a business-led organisation, so we work with employers all across the country, and our focus is really simple, is that housing affordability has now become a workforce issue, which means it's also become a productivity issue. And so that's why we've joined this partnership with SGS and with National Shelter this year. SGS obviously bringing the rigorous data and analysis, National Shelter bringing the social lens, the policy lens, the lived experience. Housing All Australians, we bring the economic and the business lens. So the perspective from employers who are struggling to keep their doors open because people can't find homes. During the preparation of this report and through our own work that we're doing, we've had a lot of different conversations with all different types of organisations you can imagine. So large-scale national employers, small regional operators, aged care providers, hospitality venues, construction, childcare, and the same message continually keeps coming up again and again. We have jobs. What we don't have is workers, and we don't have those workers because they can't find places to live. So really, for us, it's not a theoretical thing. There's childcare centres that can't find educators. There's restaurants, cafes that can't open full hours. Health providers who simply just can't recruit essential roles because housing is the barrier for their staff. And this is very much what we see reflected in this year's RAI. As we've talked about, there's some really early signs of stabilisation in the major cities, or in some major cities, which is really encouraging, but I think it's still very fragile. It reflects a mix of pressures and some positive policy steps, but very much in the regions, the story is much tougher. Affordability continues to deteriorate, and those impacts, they're showing up very quickly and very real in small communities. I definitely don't want to go back over the data because I think we've had a look at that, but I think what we do want to say from a business perspective is really clear, is that housing affordability is now directly connected to Australia's economic performance. That matters because the Commonwealth Government right now is really focused on productivity, but productivity doesn't happen in a vacuum. It requires workers, it requires services, it requires functioning local economies. And without housing, none of that holds together. One specific story that really stayed with me through this process that we uncovered was a discussion I was having with a mayor in regional New South Wales who who was telling me about the local school having to put teachers up in the caravan park while they searched for somewhere permanent. Most came in, most stayed a couple of months, couldn't secure a private rental, and then left town. And he said this cycle just kept repeating. And they weren't short of people wanting to work there. They were short of staff because people simply couldn't find anywhere to live at any price. And so that really sums up what the RAI is telling us through this data. Behind all the charts, there are these businesses and workers trying to make the system function, and we see housing as the major constraint on that. So that's why we say that the private sector really needs to be part of this conversation. The scale of this challenge is very much, it's simply too big for government to solve alone. That's not a criticism, it's not about blame, it's just the reality. Housing's tied into planning, infrastructure, land policy, skills shortages, finance, taxation. It's really complicated and it touches all parts of the economy. So I think, you know, we have to acknowledge no single actor is going to fix this. Yes, government has a really critical, important role, and we're seeing those important steps over the last couple of years. All of it matters, but we strongly say that the private sector can't sit on the sidelines and isn't and shouldn't. It's the ones who are employing the workers who are affected. It's running the businesses that depend on those workers. And increasingly, I think businesses are now starting to understand that if staff can't find a home, their business can't function. So when we say that the private sector needs to be part of the solution, we're talking about two things really. Firstly, it's participation. And so that could mean unlocking buildings for meanwhile use, which is a lot of work that we do, offering their skills or capital or land and being part of local solutions and real specific regional strategies. And secondly, we need different ways to deliver affordable housing at scale and not rely solely on government budgets to get there. Philanthropy can't do it on its own, and traditional development models aren't going to deliver the volume that we need. So at Housing All Australians, we're working on different models, including the PRADS digital register that can bring government, community housing, and the private sector together, all to deliver affordable rentals in a really transparent, commercially viable way. That's not what we're here to talk about today, but I think our point is the business community is really ready to contribute, and the RAR gives us that evidence base to understand where and how that contribution can make the most impact. Because ultimately, this isn't about blame, it's about alignment. Government, business, and community, we all have a role to play. The challenge is simply too large for any one part of the system to solve. And so I think if we all want a productive, competitive Australia where essential services run, where businesses can grow, where communities can thrive, then I think we really do need to treat housing as that economic infrastructure that it is. So this year's report really shines a light on that, and I think that's why we as Housing All Australians are really proud to be part of this. So yeah, thanks everyone, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Dan. That's a great overview. And I must say, when we did our briefing in Parliament on Monday, which we quite often do when we release the Rental Affordability Index, this year especially I found the engagement by politicians very strong. Lots of questions like what can we do, what blockages can we take away so that we can actually get more supply out there and better affordability, noticing, of course, that supply is not the only factor there. We've got some time, luckily, for some Q&A. Thank you for those people already sending through some questions. And we received some questions up front as well from a few very enthusiastic participants. So thank you for that. I actually wanted, with my first question, then, just to stay with the private sector. What sort of, you already mentioned a few things, of course, what the private sector can do, but what sort of incentives could really unlock and get the private sector deliver more?
Yeah, I think the big things that we're working on are trying to use what New South Wales are really leading on as density bonuses and uplift on development sites, because we understand how everything needs to be commercially viable to be able to deliver anything, let alone affordable housing and social housing. So I think just mandating things into planning permits and saying X percentage needs to be delivered at X wage, thresholds, I think we see it's not going to solve the scale in which it needs to be delivered. So it's really about building a system outside of the government funding, the HAF and those sorts of programs that enables the private sector to be able to invest in the delivery of those under market, non-market subsidized homes. That we think there's a pathway there that it can be transparent, it can be monitored, it can be rented through a real estate agent. And that will hopefully, or not hopefully, it will breach the scale of the HAF, which is fantastic, and it's a really important tool that is really just starting to take off. But we know that it needs to be 3 or 4 times bigger over the next few decades. So yeah, it's trying to engage different parts of the sector to be able to deliver that at scale.
And that could be, in your view, quite a lever that unlocks scale density bonuses and uplifts.
Mm-hmm.
I was just wondering in that regard, yes, we do need to increase that supply by so much. John, you showed me an interesting little graph today that was sent to you about, and it showed, well, maybe you can tell us what it showed, but also I thought there was on the very left end of that graph, you actually saw what the production was in the like even longer ago and where we need to head to.
Yeah, it's interesting. So the general proposition is that government has again returned, central government, to itself supplying housing as part of the situation. So we need more supply and more supply of the right type in the right areas. So Australia has a history of having responded either A, when it's very late and very dire, or as a result of something else. So previous growth from the Commonwealth in terms of contributing to housing has been after the war, after the global financial crisis, or indeed because of COVID. One of the responses that we can see in graph and see, which is the graph Ellen's referring to, the previous Minister for Housing, Tanya Plibersek, was very committed to the growth of particular types of low-income housing directly from the Commonwealth. And I was able to see her. This is a great thing about being able to launch these things and brief parliamentarians in the federal parliament. I gave her a copy of the RAI, which she's well across, has known about it for a long time, including when she was housing minister. And she proudly pulled out for me saying, oh, here's a graph that somebody had sent me not long ago. This is the clear peak showing graphically of when the Commonwealth government supported the direct supply of 20,000 dwellings after the GFC, or as a result of making sure that Australia didn't slip in technically into recession. So 2 things they did. They fixed up about 80,000 existing social housing dwellings in terms of maintenance and built 20,000 more. So that idea that it shouldn't be episodic, we should be consistently, we've long called for its shelter, the HAF, the Housing Australian Future Fund, not only to be rolled out and used during an emergency or as a response to something else, but a consistent and continuous pipeline, because we know with vacancy rates of less than 1% now spreading to the regions, particularly for people on low and very low incomes, this will take a while to get to the numbers that we need before we're going to get the constant supply. So taking on board what Dan's saying, with the private sector doing this in conjunction as a PPP, often the term used, private partnership with government, these are the sorts of numbers that we need. So yeah, not only have they done it in the past, they've done that at scale, Commonwealth leading, and they continue to be part of the stock of social and affordable housing. So we're big fans, of course, of having supply, but we need supply of the right type. And we want to make sure, whether it's through a planning bonus, through government building it directly, anything that has the word affordable, capital A affordable, we really want to make sure it's making the most difference to people on lowest and the very low incomes. We call that the 30-40 rule. No one should be paying 30% of their income, especially people who earn the bottom 2 quintiles of income. Government has a role to directly increase the supply. It's done it in the past. It's worked. And indeed, those particular properties, all 20,000 of them, are still in the system. They weren't just there for 10, 15 or 20 years. They remain available for low and very low income. So we're looking forward to hoping that the 21,000 properties that were announced this week, basically half social, half affordable, also stay in the system forever. That's what we need.
Great, thank you. There's been a few questions, and I'm sort of mixing them a bit together. Of course, you mentioned diversity of housing and different sort of rents. First of all, there's the fact, of course, when you build below market rent, how do you get the market involved? I think you already mentioned a few things there, Dan. But also it was mentioned, of course, build to rent is often quite high rents. And why do we still think that is actually important that we also deliver that? For anyone who would like to answer.
I mean, I'm happy to have a go. At the end of the day, we know that the market, in polite company, we say falls short. The market fails particular groups repeatedly, and the need for government to intervene is pretty clear. What we also recognise is that subsidised housing needs a subsidy, but different types of groups can be met by a different level of subsidy. So when it's somebody on what's called a statutory income, the subsidy needs to be deep to make sure that the person isn't experiencing the stress. There are other segments, though, where a little bit of relief could provide an extraordinary difference to people. So we at Shelter just say if it's capital A affordable housing and it's known to be that, it should still be aimed at a particular group. But any time that people get a discount off their rent that they're not paying as much as they otherwise would, it's still needed. We have vacancy rates of less than 1%, particularly when you add that with the lack of diversity of supply. So we need one-bedroom units in small country towns. We need three-bedroom units that are affordable for people to rent in the city. If you can add the other A's together, it's got to be affordable as well as accessible and adaptable and have good amenity. There is relief needed in a number of areas. So we're not saying that it's not important. We just don't want to make sure. We just want to make sure that at any discount, if it's 20% off what is otherwise a very high rental rate, sure, that provides some relief. But the type of relief that we say is most targeted and most needed and makes the most difference is the capital A affordable bit, which is really linked necessarily to income, not just a reduction in rents.
Thank you. What sort of role do you think, John and Dan, that build to rent can and should be playing in the future and in trying to solve the shortage and affordability of housing?
Yeah, I think it's obviously still very new. There's a fair bit going on in Melbourne, but there's not a huge amount happening. And I think we kind of look overseas to more mature build to rent markets about what this could become for us. Ultimately, it comes down to diversity and it's just more options for renters. Obviously, the best things are long-term secure leases for people. We're not, as a country, we're very obsessed with home ownership. I think that is changing and has to change. So this is another pathway for people to put down roots in communities. Kids can go to schools and you know that in 12 months' time, you're not probably going to get a knock on the door and say, okay, it's time to, good luck out there. So I think taking the landlord from a mum and dad who are dealing with their own kind of financial pressures and situations and into the hands of a business that looks at this for 30 years plus, there's pros and cons, but there's obviously a security is probably the biggest one. So I guess as it becomes a more normalized thing in our country, I think people will start to understand it and know the role that it plays.
Thank you. John, did you want to say
Yeah,
something?
just again, it's emblematic of trying to do something different. The US has a tax credit system. Most of the affordable housing in the US is predicated on this type of arrangement, whereas we might say the UK tends to build properties. So in Australia, through these sorts of products, we have the ability really to have, like we often call the Parliament, a Washminster system. That is a bit from the US and a bit from the UK. You add the two together. We need long-term government building of properties. But the long-term ability of the taxation system controlled by the Commonwealth directly to also increase supply is something that we've done previously through a program called NRAS. I think the build to rent really does emblematically represent the Commonwealth returning directly about renters, a better deal, a different product, making it not so speculative, but definitely saying it can operate through the tax system as well as properties. So to finish, sometimes we might say, let's save affordable housing that is built and owned by government to be really it's needed for people on very, very low incomes. Whereas through the planning system, affordable housing through tax might be a product that's better suited to lower paid workers. The two can work in unison.
Okay, thank you. Zeki Shan, this is probably mostly for you, the next question. I saw a few questions coming around, maybe also suggesting some possible innovations to the rental affordability index. Some of them we've looked at already in the past. One person was asking, of course, it's a price index, so we don't really do like one of the other indexes does, is actually how much of the housing is available for what sort of groups in household types and groups in society. First of all, is there an opportunity to sort of provide a bit more depth in the RAI, although we don't look at quantums in terms of how these things are distributed? And the other one is around, yes, there's an option also to map vacancy rates, because they are, of course, very relevant to rental affordability.
Yeah. So there definitely is opportunity to expand it, and that's something we've been thinking of doing. I also saw a question around trade-offs and if the rental affordability index measures things like commute times. So the answer to that is at the moment, no, but that's definitely true. We all know that in reality, that's how people make their choices. And it's probably something that we will start looking at, especially as Dan was mentioning, how this is an economic issue and not just a social issue. We want to look at things like commute time and the ability of businesses to access workers in future, and similar to that, to the vacancy rate question and also the distribution of rents. We want to build on what's now a clear message around affordability and expand that to incorporate the availability question. So even if you can afford a particular area, how easy is it for you to find a rental there? And tracking those will help build out the story, and then hopefully be useful for policy to inform where supply needs to be increased, where interventions need to happen.
Thank you. Tom is also quickly scanning as much as I can questions coming through. There was one more around sort of the caps around rent increases. Someone wondering whether that can actually lead to a reduction in supply. I think the answer is quite simple to that. The introduction of the measure in the ACT hasn't really, of course, it already is shown that isn't really capping supply, but the key thing, of course, is it's a cap on excessive rent increases. So you can still increase rents by more than CPI, Consumer Price Index. And if you want to increase rents even more, you can actually put in an application to a committee, but then you have to show that you actually improved the quality of the home. It's something that exists in many countries. Some countries, they have point systems to show the amount of points, dwelling scores, and on the basis of that, you can determine rent. So in a market where demand is so inelastic, it's a typical measure that's applied quite successfully, as long as you don't put it in too stringently. There's also a bit of questions here and there throughout a section around the role of infill housing and missing middle. Anyone would like to respond to that?
I will. So just generally, we've seen a great realization that there's underutilization, particularly in inner ring areas. So there's often a missing middle of three types. We're missing that the suburbs that are often well located have had an exodus of people living there. So smaller number of average persons per household. We've seen that in Sydney and Melbourne. We've got demographic missings where we've got whole areas of Sydney again where there aren't younger people. There aren't younger people with children renting. There aren't younger people with, the Productivity Commissioner in New South Wales often says we don't really want to have a whole city where there's no grandchildren there. And then finally, typology, where the missing middle, when we talk about it, often means more mid to low to mid-rise development. So in New South Wales, we've encouraged more mid to low rise. And the trade-off means that if you get higher bonuses, generally 30% more height or 30% more floor space, you get to build more than you would otherwise, provided a certain percentage of it comes back as affordable housing. So the infill, what we see is these are areas that are ideally placed, usually in terms of transport and services, The developments struggle to otherwise be feasible. The rents aren't necessarily high. The cost of construction and the requirements to build mean that we need an incentive, often height and extra space. The trade-off for that private good in terms of the public benefit is expressed and articulated as more affordable housing. That's how the two work together. And just to finish, sometimes the state government, certainly New South Wales, other governments have said, we so see the need for that. It's a statewide issue. It overrides any particular council's concerns or objection. That's the balance. I'm pleased to say in New South Wales, there's been a number of councils faced with what would otherwise be a statewide compliance or requirement, have said we'll come up with our own more nuanced scheme involving our communities, and that's happened a couple of times here in Sydney just recently. So infill is often seen as being needed. One of the things that gives the infill the incentive is the percentage of affordable housing that will result. Just to finish though, it really is affordable housing, not social housing, that gets generated through such schemes.
Thank you. Dan, anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I think John's definitely captured it. I think what sparks to me is the conversation that we've continually had about people moving to the regions and taking their Sydney wages out to, regional New South Wales and what that's done to the private rental market. I think when we talk about the missing middle, that's geographically a solution to that happening, and just giving other people more diversity of choice. I know there's been a hell of a lot happening here in Victoria and in New South Wales and all across the country, and I think it has been difficult for some established areas to be able to translate medium density, higher density, even townhouses, as our cities are changing. But I think people are now, with this sort of data in front of you, really understanding the importance of continuing to grow and change and not necessarily just bleed further and further and further out to the regions.
Thank you. Just talking about the regions, there's there were some very interesting comments throughout the whole Q&A area, but of course the regions have come up also in this release as an area where things are getting really dire, with some regional areas actually worse off than their urban counterparts, partly also because of lower average incomes. One of the questions, what can we do, and I'm probably combining two questions there, what can we do to unlock supply in the regions, and or what role does local government could local government play?
Can I just touch on that very quickly? All levels of government need to be involved. Often we think it's the state, local councils, often in regional towns, and not, they're flat out with the resources they've got doing what they call roads, rates, and rubbish. Increasingly, we see really innovative local councils saying, we've got what we might call an on-grade car park. Can we make that available through a community housing organisation that's registered and regulated? Get them to provide some housing. The council can retain ownership, or it could be a long lease of the land. That's a pretty proven way of doing things in other jurisdictions. We're seeing that more and more. Just to finish though, we have given feedback, and I think it has been taken on board by a number of people. The HAF Round 3, the Housing Australia Future Fund, definitely has a commitment, so going right up to the Commonwealth, saying we need to target regional housing as part of the types of projects that we'll assess and give weighting to in terms of what's needed. So again, just this week, this is literally straight out of the horse's mouth in terms of ministerial advisors and such. A strong commitment from the federal government to do better in the regions through the 21,000 properties that are being delivered. Expressly, a number of those will be targeting regional areas, particularly for Aboriginal families, often missing out on these things. Again, so the government, when it has its levers, can A, build the housing, and B, compel them to be directed in areas which are missing out. Local councils, government, and both levels of government, all three working together, really does produce some extraordinary results.
Thanks so much, John. We're slowly getting to the end of the time already. And also just to acknowledge one of the questions around someone mentioning that they have to pay 80% of their income on rent. And how can it be acceptable in our society, and how fair is it? It's not, obviously. We all hope we can get ourselves out of this problem that we've getting ourselves into for several decades, I think. I'll have to bring this to a close. There's quite a lot of questions open still, so unfortunately we haven't been able to respond to all of them. It clearly shows that there's a lot of interest in this area, lots still also to explore. I think we've heard some very good responses today. What was your word again of the mixture of the UK and the US system, John?
Washminster. So
Washminster
yeah,
system.
a bit of
I
both.
really
A bit of
like
both.
that. That's probably one we can explore a little bit further. Kishan, I think we might have a link we can bring on the screen of where we can access the report as well. So please use that. Then also mention briefly, of course, that one thing I think we haven't mentioned yet with affordable housing is that we actually don't have a good system in place at the moment to monitor where are these houses and are they still affordable. So that's one of the things Housing All Australians is trying to address, among other things. I'd just like to thank everyone very much for attending today. I believe this session has been recorded, so can be made available afterwards as well. And we're quite happy to respond to any questions if you would like to contact us after the session. Thank you so much, Dan, John, and Kishan. And also in the background, Natalie, who's been making all these sessions possible and has been very busy in the background getting the report to a good standard and getting us all organized, which is not easy, I'm sure. So thank you so much. And hopefully see you all soon in the future.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.